So two things before I get started on this. First, this presentation was originally created for a job candidate presentation at a university that will be mentioned later in this presentation. So that's they gave me this topic, and I kind of ran with it. To go off of that, I apologize for like the 10 people in this room that have already seen this presentation from when I was practicing for that. So we're going to talk, oh gosh, I have a lot of things in my hands right now. Whew, I've done this presentation so many times and I'm so really nervous. All right, so in order to dissect the intersections of race, archives, and campus communities, I'm going to address pairings of these issues in order to form a deeper understanding of how they are all interconnected. So we're going to start with race and archives. And in that way, we're going to start with a little bit of theory. So in 2013, Wendy Duff and her collaborators did kind of a survey, an interdisciplinary survey to define social justice. And their definition found that social justice strives toward full human recognition, fair and just redistribution of power, full and equal participation, acknowledgement and remediation of historical inequalities with specific measures. And social justice strives against dominance and systemic inequities, disrespect, marginalization, exclusion, and non-recognition. And in the last decade or so, archival theory has also been taking on social justice as a goal. In 2007, prominent archivist and former Society of the American Archivists President Randall Jimerson wrote an article that called for a social justice imperative for the archives. And in that he said, archivists have a moral, professional responsibility to balance that support given to the status quo by giving equal voice to those groups that too often have been marginalized and silenced. And that's how he supported this call. And pretty much this is to say, the archive has never been a neutral space. Anthony Dunbar actually went on to suggest that using critical race theory in the archive, using that approach assumes that subjectivity in a record is present because of its very existence. That is to say, the record is subjective because it was made by humans in reaction to a human event. Then the record was by another human, someone made another subjective decision about that record to put it into an archive. So kind of, we're just saying, we have to say goodbye to tradition, neutrality, and objectivity, and replace that with new thinking that acknowledges and learns from critiques of whiteness and structural inequality. So acknowledging the politicization and privilege of the archive is the first step towards, to quote Michelle Caswell, a more equitable distribution of economic opportunity, the empowering effects of self-representation, and an analysis of power and its abuses. Archival resources can help marginalized communities in many ways, such as through legal help, along with the very structuring of their existence and identities. This reminds me of a story that I heard from the historian Seneca Joyner last year at a talk she actually gave here. In that talk, she talked about, she was doing research on Afro-Latina women at the turn of the 20th century in Venezuela. And she went to the National Archives of Venezuela, this is their homepage, and went to the archivist and said, I'd like all your materials about Black women in Venezuela at the turn of the 20th century. And the archivist said to her, oh, there are no Black people here. And she was like, but I'm here in Venezuela, and I see people, and they look like they might be Black. So I don't really understand what you're saying to me right now. So she kind of pushed back at the archivist, and what she came upon was layers of identity development and consolidation in Venezuela that attempted to eliminate racial signifiers in order to create a united population. So this process also happened to eliminate the histories of different races in the country, and it wasn't until Joyner specifically changed her language and specifically sought out information about disenfranchised women at the turn of the 20th century that she came upon a mountain of records, including things like photographs about the very subjects that she was looking for. So this is a really good example of how power structures in society can map themselves onto archives, and applying social justice and critical race theory to the archives seeks to change these structures, and to acknowledge that archives hold our collective memories and that these spaces should be democratically negotiated. I'm gonna put another Anthony Dunbar quote up because he's just great. So action steps are needed to make theoretical into the practical. Anthony Dunbar also says that critical race theory techniques of evidential rectifying could be useful to archival discourse in terms of broadening notions of what constitutes a record, the role of human subjects documented as co-creators of the record, and assumptions about archives and archivists as neutral third parties in the preservation and use of the record and other forms of historical evidence, which we previously touched on a little bit with the whole eliminate objectivity as something that we can claim. So how I've done this a little bit in my own work here at SLIS. Last semester I was in a digital libraries class where we digitized a scrapbook of a former alumni here at Simmons. She was here between 1915 and 1919. She was actually a library student. So we scanned the scrapbook, we created metadata for I think 498 objects total, and I was the chair of the metadata committee for that process. And everything was pretty standard. Honestly, the scrapbook was a little boring. She went to plays. There was a fake mustache in there that was kind of cool. 100-year-old fake mustache. And then we came across this. So from the cover, it's kind of hopefully you can see it. It's a program for something at the Majestic Theater in Boston. There's this kind of cool image on the front. It's a little Art Deco. I don't know if I'm using Art Deco properly there. I'm sorry, art historians, not me. And then we opened it up and realized that this was a program for Birth of a Nation playing here in Boston. So for those of you that don't know, that is G.W. Griffith's revisionist film about the strengthening of white supremacy and the rise of the KKK after the Civil War. This film was protested across the country as being revisionist and extremely racist, and that occurs to this day. And as we started to kind of dig into why this program was here, what was Birth of a Nation like in Boston, we found out that nowhere in the country was this screening protested more than in Boston, which we can all have opinions about that if you live in Boston. So along with a lot of members of the NAACP, journalists and activist William Monroe Trotter flooded local government with petitions and letters and protests to stop this screening, and it led to the mayor of Boston asking Griffith to cut out some of the more incendiary parts of the movie, which when the screening actually went forward, he didn't do. Surprise, surprise. And actually, another thing that happened was some Black activists tried to buy tickets to the screening, and they were arrested. So just by doing a little bit of digging about this program in the scrapbook, we unearthed a ton of information about history in Boston that wasn't in the scrapbook but was connected to it, and led to our creator going to the screening and thinking this program was important enough to put in the scrapbook that then sat in our archive. So how did we address this? First, we went ahead and put the historical context for all of this up on the historical context page of the digital scrapbook. And then we, perfectly with Erin's presentation, went to some subject headings. So along with Griffith's name and motion pictures, we kind of were using creator names as subject headings. We also used white supremacy movements and the subject heading for the KKK of the 19th century. The archive holds the past, and archivists are not these magical neutral parties who have the ability to completely be objective in the way we collect, describe, organize, and create interest in collections. And kind of digging deeper and creating access to the stories that aren't immediately obvious in an object can start to apply that critical race theory and social justice to our archival work. And there are a lot of archives that have been doing this work and are starting new work. Two of my favorite projects like this have come up around the Black Lives Matter protests in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland, around the deaths of Mike Brown and Freddie Gray, who were murdered by police officers. One of them is the Documenting Ferguson Archive, and the other is the Baltimore Uprising Archive. Both of these are created in collaboration between academics, students, activists, community organizers, and other members of the involved communities. They're creating archival space and preservation planning for items which would not have been in the archives even 10 years ago, especially considering social media and the digital revolution and that everyone has a smartphone in their pocket. And these collaborative efforts depend on archivists and archives that are stepping up to the plate, that are incorporating social justice and anti-racism into the core of their operations. That's the longest part of this, I promise. So next we're gonna look at race and campus communities. A really light topic here today. So there are institutions outside of libraries and archives that are going through the process of addressing racism and other forms of oppression across their student bodies, course structures, and general operations. As probably most of you know, last fall, Black students at the University of Missouri formed a group which they called Concerned Student 1950, using 1950 as the first year that Black students were accepted into the University of Missouri. Protesters demanded that their university take steps to address racism and inequality on campus. And when the president of the school did not address their concerns, they called for his resignation. After days of protesting from students, faculty, and staff, a hunger strike, and the university's lucrative football team joining the protest, the president ended up resigning. But this didn't end there. This protest at Mizzou sparked protests across the country. And these protests were led by students that saw the racism at Mizzou reflected in their own institutions. As of December, 77 schools have posted lists of demands. This is thedemands.org if you want to take a look, asking that their administrations address structural inequality. And I did a not so brief survey of all of these lists of demands, and I came across 6 concrete demands. First was support for students of color in academic environments which have historically sought to exclude them, including improved mental health resources and career development opportunities. Second was the increased hiring of faculty and staff of color, particularly in tenure-track positions. Third was mandatory diversity, inclusion, and cultural competency training. We can have a discussion about cultural competencies more because I really like that discussion. For all students, faculty, and staff. Fourth was a direct line of communication between students and university administration that creates transparency and accountability. Fifth, changes to the curriculum to reflect a range of experiences, especially in core classes in which all students can participate in diverse learning, not just that one elective that you take with all the people that believe the same things that you believe and no one actually learns anything new. And finally, but most importantly, creating a diverse student body, not through like a couple scholarships here and there, but through a commitment to greater support for recruiting, the admissions, financial support, and retention, most importantly, of students of color. And we actually do have examples of what it looks like when institutions incorporate social justice imperatives into their core of their strategic planning. And this is where I'm going to talk about the university that I made this presentation for originally. And that is the University of Richmond in Richmond, Virginia, also known as the capital of the Confederacy. It's an interesting place. But the University of Richmond, about 6 years ago, created a strategic plan they called the Richmond Promise to address structural inequality at their university. And though it wasn't a magical, like we just fixed everything in 5 years, there were some really astounding changes at the University of Richmond. First, they increased their domestic students of color by 17%. They also hired 101 tenured and tenure-track professors. 51% of them were women, and 21% were faculty of color. And for me, the coolest thing that they established was a fellowship program where every single undergraduate student was guaranteed 1 summer of funding to work on a research project or an internship of their choosing, and they had mentors that were professors. And can you imagine like having an internship funded in undergrad, having an internship funded now? And I did so much research, like preparing for this interview and for this presentation. Though I'm getting like a little goosebumps. The work that these kids are doing is incredible. At the University of Richmond, here's a really weird thing. The university doesn't hold the university collections. They are held by the Virginia Baptist Historical Society, which is housed in their library, but is a separate entity. There are no finding aids. There are 2 people that work there. They are what you might imagine Virginia Baptist Historical Society people might be like. A little bit closed off. 5 minutes, oh no, I'm only on point 2. And when a professor at that school went to the director of his archive and said, "Can I see the stuff that you have on like racism here?" He was like, "What do you want? We don't have that. Like, do you want me to bring you out a race box?" And dude, the whole archive is a race box. It's a private institution in Virginia. Like everything in that archive has to do with the stuff, but no one can get to it. So that's me going on about the University of Virginia for too long. So taking student concerns about racism and discrimination seriously on campus has resulted in a change I don't see in a lot of other places, in a lot of other institutions. These are headlines from their student newspaper that are conversations I don't see a lot of people having. And a lot of these articles are not written by students, they're written by professors. There's conversations and relationships happening at the University of Richmond that are really dedicated to diversity and inclusion and social justice and anti-racism. So student activism isn't new, neither is racism at academic institutions, but I think we're at a particular point of intersection where student demands can mean serious change not only within institutions, but in the communities students currently inhabit and will inhabit after they graduate. A student body that feels respected and safe, that has opportunities to learn and grow without oppressive systems deciding their worth, is one which has the power to shape society for the next generation. I know that's very lofty, but that's what I told them at the University of Richmond. And I totally believe it. Maybe I'm a little too positive. So third, we're going to talk about archives and campus communities. To bring the conversation back, we can see kind of how we can start taking student demands and opening up our archives to examine race and racism and other oppressive structures can create really cool projects. These are some of the digital projects created through a collaboration between a professor and her students and the prying they did to get into the university archives at UR. Many of these projects are based in student participation and they're centered around topics relevant to the city of Richmond, the state of Virginia, civil rights activism, school desegregation, and so forth. Students at UR have also used archives for creative and political projects. For example, in 2012, students used archival materials to write and produce a play entitled With, a drama in black and white, and so much more, about desegregation in Richmond schools in 1968. And I think the title, Performing the Archive, is really cool. It's clear that students are able to find new and creative ways to use archival collections at UR, and the problem is that many students don't know that they exist or that they have access to them in most places. So it can actually be really intimidating to go into an archive as an undergraduate student. I'm sure most of you know that. I was a history undergrad, and I didn't go into an archive until my senior year. And when I did, this is the room I ended up in. This is the Rare Books and Manuscripts Division of the New York Public Library. It's huge. It's scary. You have to like email a random person and kind of convince them that the materials you're looking for should be given to you just because of who you are or what work you're doing. But it works. It's the New York Public Library, so they're actually really great about being like, here, come in and look at the stuff. And my experience here is what landed me here at Simmons doing archival work. The materials I found in the archive granted depth to my project I never thought I would have, and it was really wonderful. But at the same time, it's scary, and we need to use our both social justice and our professional training to make it a little less scary for students to get into the archive. So that's where I'm going to conclude now. Look, the slide even says conclusion. So what are the ways that we can bring race archives and campus communities back together? In a Venn diagram, perhaps? Libraries and archives across the country are expanding their policies to not only locate and acquire new collections that detail the experiences of the oppressed, but to also find materials within their existing collections and create proper access to them. These collections can support departments, students, and student organizations in their explorations of alternative perspectives anywhere. My notes say at the University of Richmond, because clearly I didn't edit them properly. So institutional support connects students directly to archives to develop cutting-edge projects and keeps archives relevant to academic success. at the University of Richmond, there's institutional support for these projects. There's line budgets to hire race and racism project archivists. What budgets? Money for this stuff? So this is their digital scholarship at UR. There's a digital scholarship lab where they do digital humanities projects. A lot of them are based on race and racism in Richmond, including this 1853 Richmond and its slave market 3D project. You should definitely go look at it. It's like a really amazing video, which literally takes the history of Richmond, Virginia, and maps it onto modern day Richmond.
Can I interrupt? Can you tell us where we can find that map?
Yes, I will tweet it. But you can also Google University of Richmond Digital Scholarship Lab. It's run by this guy named Rob Nelson. He's really cool. And then, of course, we have things like DERAIL, which is what we're doing right now, surprise, where we can take the profession on the same path and hope that institutions will support this kind of work. Thank you for listening to that very butchered version of this presentation.
We have time for a couple of
And I'll
questions.
take questions.
If anyone has some questions?
No one. Wonderful.
I
Definitely got questions.
I will
that
say
you
it's
are.
worth noting if anyone's not continually refreshing their Twitter feed like I am trying to do. Our colleagues at the University of Indiana who are having a watch party have been shouting out their university online to take a look at the research that you've done for ways that they can implement it themselves. And for any other virtual participants, we'll make these presentations available online after the event. So you can go back and take a closer look at some of the incredible research and work that not just Irina, but all of the presenters today have done. So you can take an in-depth look if the day is sort of overwhelming and you can't remember some of those facts and figures. That'll be available as well. So thank you, Irina.
So
I don't remember that.
So they gave you this topic to talk on specifically?
Yes. They
So
gave me
the
this,
question was,
yeah.
was she given this topic specifically to speak about?
Yes. Hiring at institutions is so nerve-wracking. Yes, the position that I interviewed for was a term position for 2 years where the institution has put into their budget a project on race and racism at the university specifically, which would involve archival resources, working with students and faculty to dig through these archives and create new projects to look through the history of these issues at the university and at Richmond at large. Which is like, I've never heard of that happening at an institution.
That's like the best job talk topic of all time.
Oh yeah, they sent me this.
And the best job talk ever.
Yeah. Yeah. They, I don't want to, I feel like I'm like, the University of Richmond's the best, but they're pretty great. I'm not gonna lie. They did a really good job selling me on how great this project is.
Hell yeah.
It's exciting. My face is so red.
No, it's not. Thank you, Irina.